for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India...
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is Siddhartha Vaidyanathan at SidV on Twitter. And I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Mahesh, who is at Cornered on Twitter. Hi, Mahesh.
Hi, Sidvi.
Yeah, today we have the pleasure to welcome Michael Sexton, a journalist, producer, and sports writer with over 30 years of experience. Michael, who is based in Adelaide, has worked with ABC, BBC, and Channel 9. He has written 8 books, and we are here today to talk about his latest work, which released last year, called Borders Battlers. This is a book that rewinds to the extraordinary test between India and Australia in Madras in 1986, only the second time in test history when a game ended in a tie. Anyone who watched that game then would have some memory or the other associated with it. And Michael has done a terrific job of recreating the drama and tension that enveloped the ground throughout the test, but especially on the final day. So welcome, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Great. So I would like to start off by telling our listeners that this book released last year, but for some reason it completely skipped my eye. And it was only recently that someone pointed it out to me, and I was immediately fascinated to pick it up. And I read it, and it's a great book. I'll link to it in the show notes, so please pick it up and read it. If you were not born in 1986, then it's a terrific read, so I would recommend it highly. So, Michael, let's begin with your own memories of that test. Where were you back then? How did you follow this game? And if you could just set the context.
Well, it's an interesting question you had to start off with because, of course, like virtually everyone in this country, the test match almost happened without us noticing, which seems ridiculous in hindsight, but it occurred in the mid-1980s. It occurred in the middle of winter, Australia time I'm talking about. The match was played at night, and it was during the football final season. And, of course, in this country, that's like a religion, the winter sports. So Test cricket at that point, it was... people were picking up the paper in the morning and reading a match report or perhaps hearing on radio what had happened overnight. And that's really how it happened. The match was not broadcast in this country in any form. The ABC didn't do the radio. There was no television highlights, virtually no television highlights. So in many respects, it kind of adds to the mystery of the game. It's in complete contrast to the other tied tests, which of course occurred in Brisbane in the early 60s between West Indies and Australia. And that was the reverse in that was one of the first series that was broadcast on television across Australia, and it captivated the nation what was going to happen. Whereas the test match in Madras was almost a mysterious event that happened at night. And so in many ways, it's never quite, in my opinion, had the kudos that it deserves for the epic game that it was. So I guess I'm afraid I'm like most Australians, and that was that I would have been aware that it was going on, the match, but certainly didn't follow it ball by ball.
Very interesting. So yes, I did know about this. So also the additional point here was, of course, that back then in the mid-80s, the Australian cricket team itself was going through quite a low period. And I would imagine that, in a multi-sport country, that cricket had already taken a bit of a back seat, given that the performances of the team weren't that inspiring.
Very much so. And you're right. I mean, one of the things I found fascinating about studying this period is that Australia, after this season, went through what became a golden age, really, in the latter years of Alan Border's career, and then with Mark Taylor and Steve Waugh and Ricky Ponting, they had success after success. But in the early and mid-1980s, Australian cricket was really on its knees. A series of events had happened. First of all, they had World Series cricket in the late 70s, which had really split the cricket community very badly, and a lot of those wounds had never properly healed. And then they had the Rebel Tours to South Africa, which took a number of senior players, plus possibly some of the next generation of great players who went. And then in one single moment, they lost Dennis Lillee, Rod Marsh and Greg Chappell all to retirement. So you lost three of the all-time greatest players. And then this awful business where Kim Hughes found the captaincy overwhelming, and he had to hand the captaincy on to Alan Border, who was the most senior player. And Alan really didn't want to be captain of Australia. It's hard to believe in hindsight that a game which is really the national sport of this country was in a situation where you had a reluctant captain, a group of players who were playing for themselves. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean in the sense that they were struggling to survive at the highest level. And if sportsmen are struggling in that position, they tend to become self-centred. It's about survival. And they were losing to everyone. I mean, Australia had never lost to New Zealand before, and they lost 2 consecutive series inside 3 months. The test match at Brisbane against New Zealand, Richard Hadley, in one of the greatest bowling performances ever. I mean, he just destroyed them. So the part of the interest I had in this writing about the Tide Test was that this was really, to use a cliche, the line in the sand for Australia. This was where Border really had to kind of say, you know what, we have to stop losing. We have to have a result. And I really think that was part of the charm of this game, is that it was such an epic contest in a country far away from home, where they really started to find them at their way back in world cricket.
Yeah, so you do write about that period in the series against New Zealand, when the couple of series when they lost, and when Alan Border was, of course, not in the best frame of mind. But, apart from what you mentioned, was there any other impetus to write this book at the time that you wrote it? Or was it just something that came up? Because it was 2019, and as far as I could see, there was no anniversary or anything of that sort. So was there any reason for the timing?
No, it's a good question. Normally there is a 5 or a 0 attached, isn't there? It's 20 years or 25 years. It was really just I was looking for a project. I'd written a book previously about Ian Chappell in the 70s, and that had been quite successful, and the publisher was interested. And it was a game that had always interested me. And I think also, I'm fascinated with India and the subcontinent. I just think it's such an interesting place. And again, getting back to this theme, for Australians of a certain generation, times have changed, but for a certain generation, India was a mysterious country that we knew about from history books, perhaps. And, it was just a place that people had stories about that seemed impossible to believe. And so it's always interesting. I think the two great challenges for Australian cricket was to win in India and to win in the West Indies. And those two places were really interesting to me. And so I became more and more interested in that, and also interested in the story of the people who ended up going.
All right. So let's talk a bit about the process of writing this book itself. First, with the research and so the players you met. I mean, you do mention the players in the book. You do mention the players that you spoke to, but did you end up meeting quite a few of them? Were there a lot of online interviews? And talk a bit about that.
So it was a couple of ways I went about it. First of all, the good news is that if you have even a modest test career in Australia, you pretty much end up getting a book contract. So fairly well everyone who has played test cricket for Australia at one time or another has a memoir, which is always really handy to read those books. And those sort of things gave me a great base. Now, the reality is also that getting access to players, I'm sure is the same in India, is not easy because of various vested interests. So in a sense, a lot of the preliminary interviews I did were bits and pieces that I picked up along the way. For example, when I was working at the ABC, Steve Waugh had been dropped from the Australian team and he was playing for New South Wales in a match against South Australia. And I went down to their New South Wales training one night and he had some things to say there. And I asked him about the Tide Test there. And so sometimes there were snippets of information I got from them. But the key moment came for me when there was a charity match played in the Barossa Valley, which is a wine-growing region north of Adelaide. And it was a fundraiser for the late David Hooks' charity. And India were touring at the time, and they brought together a number of players who'd played in the Tide Test. And it was a very informal gathering. So I was able to speak to Dave Gilbert. The two umpires were there. Ray Bright was there, Bruce Reid was there, Dave Gilbert, as I said. And also, just as a side, Vishen Bedi was there, which is a personal thrill because he's just one of my favourite cricketers, and so I happened to speak to him. But the key to it was getting Greg Matthews. Now, Greg Matthews is an eccentric person. He's differently wired to most people and most cricketers, which makes him so interesting. But he's also quite reluctant to speak. He's not easy to get him to talk. You don't often see him interviewed and so forth, even though when he does, he's so interesting. But in that informal setting, I was able to get to him. And the raw enthusiasm he had for that Tide test, I mean, his eyes lit up when he wanted to talk about it. And it was, if I could describe it to you, it was quite hilarious because we were talking about what had happened. And sometimes stupid questions get good answers. And on this occasion, I asked a stupid question because I said to him, when you lined up to bowl that last over on the final day, and were you aware of the history that was in your hands? And he looked at me as if, it really was a ridiculous thing to say. He said, of course I was aware of it. Of course I knew standing up there exactly what the moment was. He then proceeded, rather than answer the question, to reenact the entire final over in which he played the role of bowler, batsman, fielder and umpire. And it was brilliant. It was like a vaudeville show. And he commentated that entire over as well. And he knew every ball went, everybody who fielded it, what everyone said. It was absolutely fantastic. And I thought, at the time, I have to write, eventually I'm going to have to write about this test match because it meant so much to these guys. And Ray Bright was the same, and Dave Gilbert, who was 12th man. I mean, they spoke with such passion about it. So that was, I got a lot of those guys. Now, the other great fortune I had was that at the ABC had done a documentary on the 20th anniversary, which some of you, I don't know if you've seen, it's probably on YouTube, called Madras Magic, which was about the 20th anniversary. Now, they had interviewed a number of the key people, and they allowed me to look at the interviews they had done. And, for example, the interview they did with Dean Jones for that documentary series went for over an hour. So that was just rich with detail. And then what I found, the last thing I found that was really helpful was there's often, I find, there's a number of people who aren't necessarily the stars, who rarely get interviewed, but who often have very interesting perspectives and details. And so I chased down quite a few of those people, and that was really worth the effort. And they were just people I was able to ring at their home and talk to them, people like Errol Alcott, who was the Australian team physio, the Australian team manager, to talk to guys who weren't actually playing in the 11, Michael Valletta, for example, and they were really good because they were able to give a perspective and in many respects had never been interviewed before about the game.
Yeah, those are the parts of the book that really stuck with me as well. I mean, I have seen that documentary, Madras Magic, and so a lot of the quotes seemed a bit familiar from before, but the people who you speak about, Valletta and Errol Alcott especially. I mean, Alcott has an elephantine memory, the detail that he remembers from each day. And this, given the fact that he was not that big a cricket fan. I mean, as you say, his nickname was Hooter because he once asked, when does the Hooter go off when the match ends? So
he was fantastic. He was difficult to get originally. He was a little reluctant to talk about it. And my sense of that was that he had over the years formed such a personal relationship with the players and probably had seen and dealt with them at their lowest points. And so therefore had a certain protective instinct about them. And I suspect that was part of it. But once he agreed to talk, he was fantastic. And he has, because he was a physio, I think he came from, I guess, a science background. So he was very logical in his process. He'd also kept notebooks, which he brought out. And in those notebooks, for example, this is very basic sports science, but at the time no one was really doing it. He used to weigh all the players, for example, before they went out to bat, and then he would weigh them again afterwards to see how much weight they'd lost and to try to get fluids into them, and he was trying to do those things. His father had been a doctor. So he had that side of it, and he really did remember. I mean, his recall of the circumstance at the end of the second day's play when Dean Jones was taken to hospital was tremendous. And he was full of praise for Indian medical staff, but also his descriptions of the chaos involved of trying to take a player. And yet there was Alan Border, captain of the Australian side, who actually wasn't aware that Jones was even in hospital really until they'd got back to the hotel. And then he goes to visit Jones in hospital and sort of sits at the seat of his bed watching TV, because it was such an unlikely event in what was going on. But Olcott was the one who saw the seriousness of the moment and realised that, you know, these guys were being pushed to the point of serious illness, and he had to act. So he was fantastic. And as I said, guys like Michael Valletta and others were really helpful. And I also tracked down several members of the travelling press party from Australia. There was only 7 who went, and they too had very rich detail of the circumstances and little moments along the way of the tour, and what it was like. And I always feel with writing, the stuff I really like reading is, rather than the hero's stories, I really like to know, you know, those sort of small, fine details about things. You know, for example, a really small one was that Bob Simpson, who was the Australian coach, he used to fill in time at the cricket by writing letters home. Shows how long ago it was. And he mentioned that, you know, when he sat down to write, you know, he couldn't because his hand kept sticking to the paper because it was so hot in the rooms. He ended up having to put this towel, wrap his arm in a towel so he could write. These are the sort of things that are really interesting, I think.
Now that you mention that second day's play, when the whole journey from the stadium to the hospital, Dean Jones was pretty much in a state of semi-consciousness, so he probably would have remembered very little. So it needed you to speak to Errol Alcott to get to know what happened. And similarly, you mentioned the next morning when Mike Coward, the veteran Australian journalist, when he woke up from his hotel, and then looked out of the hotel room window, he saw Dean Jones swimming there in the swimming pool. And so talking to Mike Coward gave you that gaze, gave you that lens through which to look at that. And I thought that was really, really interesting ways in which you told that story.
It is, and you're right. And, you know, a lot of the players thought that Dean Jones had stayed all night at hospital. And of course, he was discharged around about midnight. And it was only by talking to Mike Coward, who said, I remember seeing him swimming laps. I was then able to check back with Errol Alcott and say what happened. He said yes. And then that gave the further detail that Alcott had been for some time concerned at the cheapness of the Australian Cricket Board. The Australian Cricket Board had a bad habit of booking Australian teams into budget accommodation to save money. And Alcott was really of the saying this was really important that we have hotels and facilities where they've got a pool or a gym or something like this. And it was such an interesting detail again, because he said because Jones had been so dehydrated, he was cramping up so badly, he was so sore that the perfect release for him was to, in the morning, go swimming and just do laps and try and get his body to work again after what he'd been through the previous 2 days.
Yeah, so that was that process of triangulation is wonderful, isn't it? When you're writing this book, you don't want to just go with one source. So it's a thrill to find that second source to confirm what the first source has said.
That's it. Yeah, it's kind of like a detective story. I think Gideon Haigh once said that writing a book about a cricket match, based on match reports, is a bit like trying to write a play based on the reviews. And I know what he's getting at in that you weren't there necessarily there yourself, and you're kind of piecing together bits and pieces. But as we know, match reports are often written on the fly. They're often written very quickly, and details can be wrong. And it's fascinating sometimes to rewind and find things out. For example, I was talking to Michael Valletta, and Michael Valletta had been a chance to be in the side, but at the end they went with Dean Jones rather than him batting at 3. And I was asking him these questions along the lines of what was it like in the rooms and were you aware? And he said, what do you mean in the rooms? He said, I was on the field. He said, I was on the field watching Ravi Shastri hit 6s over my head on the final day into the crowd. And I said, well, you were 13th man. He said, well, was I? And I said, well, according to the scorecard, you were Dave Gilbert was 12th man. You were 13th man. He said, well, I don't know. I spent most of the time in the field. And it turns out that because Jones was unwell and Ray Bright was unwell, and at times Steve Waugh and Craig McDermott were unwell, that Australia more or less used Valletta as a substitute fielder for most of that match. Now, I could not find a mention in any of the match reports of Valletta being involved anywhere. And yet he said at the end of each day, and then there's a tiny bit of film, because only about 12 minutes of film exist, where you can see Valletta walking off the field, and he looks like a guy who's been on the field all day. So for me, that was really interesting as well. And I'm still to this day not sure whether or not Australia broke the rules on that.
Oh, well, I don't think there would be a way to retrospectively change the result. I'm thankful for that. How about talking about going back in time? One of the aspects of the book that I really enjoyed was you have managed to recapture the stadium in Madras as it was back then. The sounds, the smells, the humidity, and the everything that went on there. I mean, of course, you have spoken to a lot of people, but did you also make a trip or trips there? How did you go about getting the geographical specificity so well?
So there was a couple of things I did. There was a guy I knew who had filmed part of that Madras documentary. He had been to Madras. And I contacted him, and his wife had also lived in Madras for several years. And there's two things in this. The first one was that he had taken a lot of beautiful photos at the time he was there. And the stadium hadn't changed at the time he was there from when it was in 86. And he was able to point out, and I kind of just asked him, where did the players come down? Where did they sit during the game? Where was the crowd at this point? And, and he had a really good memory and a really good eye for things. And he'd say, it was really hot in the morning, so the sun would coming in this way, and, there was a fence there. And, it was really good stuff. The second thing was that his wife had lived there, and she had been to several cricket matches, and she also had taken photos and had kept a diary. And those two things combined, along with, historic photos of the time and some of the films which were available, some of the video available of the match, I was just really conscious of trying to set the scene because, as we know, stadiums come and go and things change, and it's not what we see now is not what it was like necessarily then. And, a really small example was that this famous story about Greg Matthews wearing a jumper, putting on a sweater on the final day despite the heat, which was a psychological ploy. But he said to me, I put it on, and then he said, I turned my head so I could see the Indian players, and I made sure they saw that I was wearing it. And I was trying to say to them, I'm not even worried by the heat. Look, I'm going to wear a sweater because the heat just doesn't bother me. So then I said to the guys who'd been there, I said, well, where were the Indian players sitting that this could have occurred? And, they were able to confirm that did happen. So those sorts of things, I just kind of was really conscious that anything I put in, I had to make sure that it was a correct detail, and also it was a detail that continued to tell the story rather than just in for the sake of being in.
And was there anything in here that that you felt was a discrepancy and that you couldn't include because there was something that a player said, but somebody else couldn't confirm it, or somebody else had another viewpoint on that?
Yes, there was a couple of things. It got very spiteful on the final day, very spiteful, the game. And one of the players said to me, when they went to a drinks break, he said that, and I'm not going to name the players because I don't know, but he said there was a headbutt between one of the Indian batsmen and one of the Australian fielders. They butted heads while they were going for a drink, and that they had to be kind of separated. And he told me that story, and then I was never able to completely confirm. Some people said, it probably happened, maybe it didn't happen, and, nobody really... So I didn't put in much detail about that. I was sure it did happen, but that was a discrepancy that, it's a very strong allegation to make if it didn't happen. So I was cautious with that one. The other one was that Dean Jones said to me that he thought there was a discrepancy in the scoreboards. He said the two scoreboards at the ground had different scores. And he said in the final over, I didn't know where we were at. He was the only player who said that. Alan Border said he wasn't entirely sure at the end of the game whether we, being Australia, had lost or if it was a tie. And then you had Greg Matthews saying, I knew exactly what the score was. I knew what every ball was worth. So that was, again, I just put that down to the fog of memory. You know, people have years go by and there are different things. Whether the two scoreboards were different, I don't know. But that was Jones's story. But that was one of only the few discrepancies in it.
Well, Zinedine Zidane's headbutt could have been the second most famous headbutt in the world of sport had this been confirmed.
Actually, Steve mentions this in the documentary Madras Magic, and also on the Dean Jones scoreboard thing, he mentions that again in the Madras Magic documentary as well. But like he says, nobody else talks about it, about the scoreboard being different at all. No player from either side talks about it.
I think that's it. I mean, I think it's a fine detail, and it may be true, it may not. I just don't know.
Just to sort of add to the point of capturing the authenticity and the vibe of the ground, I come from Chennai and I've watched a lot of tests at Chepauk. And when I started watching, the ground was still very similar to what it was in '86. So I was very, very delighted to see the little details that you added about, there's a stand where people sit on the floor, and next to that is a stand where people sit on the bench. But that stand is exclusively accessible only to the TNCA members. So that's the legendary D stand, and the tickets for which are not sold to the public. So you only get tickets to that stand if you have access to some club member. So I was really delighted to see all these little details come through. And also the fact that crowds go back and sort of take shelter at the top of the stands. One, it gives you the shade. And unlike the players, the crowd does get some of the breeze from the beach. For some reason, I've spoken to a lot of players about it, but it doesn't quite reach the playing surface. But crowds who are sitting at the edge of the stands do get a breeze, and it's a much needed relief from the heat.
It's very interesting you say that, because one of the questions I always had to the guys playing was that they were always disturbed by the smell coming off the Buckingham Canal. And I said to them, but did the smell also bring a breeze? And they rarely would suggest, they'd say, oh, there was a bit of a gentle breeze. The umpires said that there was a breeze in the afternoon. They said it about 3 o'clock. The other thing which I had to check too, and you can confirm this, is that the light goes very quickly. And this was part of the problem they had on the final day, was that there was this rancor going on and became very ill-tempered between the umpires and Alan Border, because Border was so slow at setting the fields. And the umpires were saying, we're going to lose the light here. The light will go. And Border was saying to them, look, it's bright, sunshine, it's hot, we've got all day. This is not a club game, this is a test match. You've got to give me time. It was very rancorous. And I'm never entirely sure, but from what I understand is that it is that in that part of the world that the light will go quickly. Whereas perhaps in England, as we know, and in parts of Australia too, you really can keep playing until 7, 8, 9 p.m. sometimes.
No, that's true. 6 o'clock is like our deadline. After 6, it gets pretty dark and like quite a dramatic, move from brightness to darkness. So I did watch the documentary just before coming here, and Ravi Shastri talks about it as well, saying he wanted to, take Border away from the situation, not so much because he was concerned about Border arguing with the umpire, but he was concerned that he was losing precious daylight.
You have to remember too, for Alan Border, this was a rare victory. I mean, he had only in the months leading up to this tour threatened not to captain Australia anymore. And in fact, he'd gone further than that. He'd actually gone and said, I'll actually retire from international cricket and just go back to playing first grade cricket for Queensland and play county cricket for Essex. I mean, that's how much he was disinterested in. He was so tired of the pressure and the loss. And now he is in this. He's played, almost 5 days of cricket, exhausting cricket, against the toughest of opponents in these circumstances. And, his brain must have been, really been struggling to think at every field placing. And remember that at the beginning of the final day, India needed four runs per over to win. And in the last over of that day, they needed 4 runs. So, the whole day had been relentless pressure. It really was never a point where they really felt that they were ever on top. And I just think there's no other sport really that possibly Grand Slam tennis events, they play 5 sets rather than 3. But that's the only other sport I can kind of think of that is in comparison where Test cricket, where you don't play the 5 days like this only in that international form, and then you go back to lower forms of the game. So it's such a testing, searching event.
Yeah, and you mentioned that bit about how Border's having this argument with the umpires, and then he looks at David Boone and he says, "They can't pull me up they can't send me off for that, can they?" And Boone's like, I forgot the exact line, but he says, "I wouldn't know," or something in slang, right?
Yeah, that's right. He says to him, "I don't know," and he walks away, and Border's kind of looking for a friend at that point. But, again, that speaks to the inexperience of the Australians. If on that tour, if you had taken everyone in the team except for Border and added up how many test matches they'd played and doubled it, they still hadn't played as many as Border. I mean, David Boone was the likely next candidate to be captain of Australia. He'd played 11 test matches and Border had played 100. So, Border was really on his own. And one of the things about that tour was the emergence of Bob Simpson, which was a very, very important part because Australia had never had a full-time coach before. And Bob Simpson came along and took a lot of pressure off Border. He said, I'll run the practice. I'll speak to the media. I'll help select the team. They were the things that he was able to say to Border, "I'll take that off your plate." I mean, Border had this nickname in this country, Captain Grumpy, which was created by the media, with good reason too, because he was really grumpy. He couldn't understand why he had to talk to the media. He didn't understand why he had to talk to them again the next day and why after next session they wanted to talk to him again and why he had to explain the team. He just wasn't that person. And so for Bob Simpson on this tour, he started to emerge as someone who said, "I can take a bit of this away from you." But yeah, that final day was really, and it's the other thing I found so interesting about this was, we've been talking a lot about the Australians. India was such a good side. And when you look back on that team that India had, virtually every year for a decade, India had found another good player who would stay in that side. They were really stable. They'd been to Australia. They were unlucky. Probably the umpires in Melbourne cost them that series in Australia. They went to England and won it 2-0. Could have been 3-0. Probably that last day of the final test, they mucked up a bit, but it could have been 3-0. Come back home and beat Australia. They really were at an apex. And it's a personal theory, but I have a feeling that they were playing in the way that their captain wanted them to. They were playing in the spirit of Chappell. And his innings in the tied test is remarkable. I mean, people talk about Dean Jones quite rightly, and Boone and Border both got hundreds, but Chappell-Dev's 100 just changed that game dramatically. And there's this brilliant story that Sunil Gavaskar tells, about how India had collapsed at the end of the third day, and they'd come in the rooms, and Chappell-Dev had given them a roast and it said to them, stop playing like it's a one-day game, and take your responsibilities, and, this is a very important game, and, stop it. And then he'd come out to bat on the fourth day, and the very first shot, he played a Larry shot over cover point, I think, for 4, and they all fell about laughing because that was Chappell-Dev. He seemed to play instinctively, but he also was not afraid of losing. This amazing story about on the final day when Chappell-Dev is out and he's coming off the field and Ravi Shastri's coming out to bat next, and Shastri deliberately walks around the sight screen so he doesn't have to cross paths with him because he's worried the captain will say to him to shut the game down, and he doesn't want to shut the game down. They want to go for the win. And I think that speaks about the Indian side of that time who were, nothing was impossible for them. The 83 World Cup proved that. And in a way, they were at a different end of the spectrum to where Australia was. And Australia was so scared of losing. They were so desperate for any success. And India they weren't afraid to win. They were afraid, they weren't afraid of things. So it's just interesting to see, isn't it, how teams at various stages of their development come across each other.
Absolutely. And talking about, you spoke about how people in Australia couldn't really see that game because it was late in the night, it was during the football season, etc., etc. Everyone in India, who was around then and who was watching television saw that game, and yet that if someone like me wants to go back and see that Kapil Dev innings, I have nothing to choose from. I think there's like one video on YouTube that has say 2 minutes or something of that innings, but what a magnificent innings, and it's just been lost to time, and nobody really can see it again. Hopefully somebody will put it up, but as of now, there's nothing much to choose from.
Well, I've never seen it, and I'd love to. He went from 50 to 100 in 16 scoring shots. Just remarkable for. That's one of the great sadnesses of all these things, isn't it? It would have been great to see those great players in their time. Now we see everything. In those days we don't, and maybe that adds a little bit to the mystique of it, the mystery of it.
Yeah, but one thing I wanted to ask, though, when we were talking about the rancor and the ill temper that went on, generally, as far as I have read, both the teams had a pretty good rapport. But it just seems that in that test, things just went, whether it was because of the weather or whether it was because of the state of the game, things just went out of hand. And the umpires became key characters in the whole drama.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's possible, there was no match referee in those times. And, India had been critical of the Australian umpires the previous summer, and Australia had been critical of the Indian umpires. And, that was often what went on, as you know, at that time until neutral umpires were introduced. There were some ugly things that were said and done. I think, the Australian wicketkeeper, Zura, was part of that. And look, I just think there was some... Australia didn't have a lot of, shall we say, humour on the final day in particular. I don't think India did either. And that's the competition, isn't it, that's going on, and the exhaustion and the heat. And as I said, in the Australian camp, there was this sense of desperation too, that, remember, they had declared twice in this match. And, it takes a special sort of moment to declare twice in a test match and still lose. So, they had a lot on the line. And the declaration, I think this is an interesting thing, was at the end of the fourth day, Border's instinct was to bat on. He wanted to bat on for at least another hour, perhaps in the fifth day, and really put the game out of India's reach. And it was Boone and it was Bob Simpson who kind of talked him out of it and said, I think that they said to Border, no one's ever made this many runs on the final day. I think it had happened twice before, but it was basically, this is the possibility of India actually running this down is so small that it's ridiculous. But if you don't give them the chance, they won't go for it. In other words, if you bat for the first hour again tomorrow, you kind of just put the game to sleep. But Border had to really be talked into that. And I suspect his emotion at the time was, I just don't want to lose again. I'd rather have a boring draw. And so, again, that's the Australians at that point of their development. They were young, they were inexperienced, they were in a hostile place to play cricket, and, a lot of the humour went out of it. And yet, I've also seen since incredible rapport between them. There was a test match dinner held in Adelaide and Ravi Shastri was there, and Greg Matthews almost knocked the doors off their hinges getting to him to sit down to talk to him. And great feeling between the teams. I know Ray Bright as well. They speak so wonderfully about those players. Alan Border's description of, David Boone's description of Sonny Gavaskar belting consecutive fours off one knee against Craig McDermott. He says, I'll never forget those long as I live. Two of the greatest shots I've ever seen in Test cricket. So in hindsight, there's great feeling. And at the time, there was incredibly difficult emotions.
Yeah, I think, it's the really interesting bit about how Kapil Dev mentions, as you quote in your book, about how had Australia batted on a bit more on the fifth day and set a target that was just out of India's reach, and then put fielders around the bat and, put the spinners on, then how India would have found it really difficult. It took me to the 2001 test in Kolkata where, India did exactly that. They batted on day 5, put the match completely pretty much out of Australia's reach, and then ended up winning that famous test. So a slight intriguing parallel on that front too.
You always, in Test cricket, there's always that sense. I mean, Ian Chappell has always said that you have to give the opposition a chance to win it, even if you can't crush teams. And I think there's a lot in that you have to, that's the beauty.
Dangle the carrot, as he says.
Yeah. Do you think we can entice them? See if they'll go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the writing itself. You could have gone about the writing in different ways, but I guess the fact that there was no extended coverage, and the fact that that you had to go on the stories made it automatic for you to choose the telescopic lens rather than look into every ball or every over, which would have been very, very difficult for you to recreate.
Yeah, I think the reality is that as a test match is like a ticking clock, isn't it? That it builds tension as it goes, but you don't want to be in a position where you're trying to describe every tick of the clock. It just becomes so difficult. I just felt that the story was so big in the stories of the two countries. And for example, I wrote some of the early chapters about previous tours that the Australians had been onto the subcontinent. And while it may seem, when you read that, a little bit, this has nothing to do with border, it actually does, because it gets back to this idea of what India meant to Australia at the time. And the Australian cricketers would say to you, if you said you're going to India or you're going to the West Indies, they'd say, we've heard all the stories, which was code for, we're worried about the food, we might get sick, we're not sure about the umpiring, we think the wickets could be difficult. All these things would come into play. And there's a great story in there of Kim Hughes, who took an Australian team. They played a one-day series in India in the early 80s. I think it was a celebration of the Ranji Shield. And he said that they had a team meeting in Brisbane beforehand, and he stood up and he said, look, crowd's going to be against us, the media's going to be against us, the wickets will be terrible, the umpiring is going to be problematic, the food's going to make you sick, and we're all, so who wants to go? And everyone put their hand up. In other words, there's a sense of this is an adventure, and a lot of that is nonsense. A lot of it's not true, but that was the image that they had. So I wanted to create that and put that in the reader's mind so that when the Australians come over, they're also carrying with them a lot of baggage and a lot of history that, Steve Waugh tells this story about, that he reckons he kind of just ate egg omelettes every day for 25 days in a row because he was so scared to eat anything else. I mean, this is the sort of fear that they brought with them. But I really enjoyed talking to the guys who'd been over before and what they'd come up against. And they were so full of joy and stories when they talked about it. None of them spoke about it as if this was a terrible thing. This was such an adventure. It's such an interesting place to go and play cricket. So I wanted to build that up. And then I also needed to bring to life some of the people, I think, so that when you see where Dean Jones is at in his career, why that innings was so important to him and where Alan Border was at and why Greg Matthews was who he was and how he responded to that. So that was what I wanted to bring into it. And also, smaller things like, that Bob Simpson had come in and Bob had brought in a really strong regime of training. He was relentless in the way he trained them. And he said, you may not be the best cricketers in the world, but you'll be the fittest. And, you'll never be the ones who are outworked. And then right before the Madras Test, they're ready for another day of training. And he says, let's just go to the beach. Let's just go and do nothing, So there's a lot of sort of stuff that goes on, which I think is quite interesting to build up the story. And then I think it gets sharper and sharper in focus. And in the end, the last few balls are worth recording because it's such a tense moment and it all comes together. And, it's a fantastic result. I mean, if it had gone one run or one wicket either way, we wouldn't be talking about it. But the fact that after 5 days it was a tied test is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that bit that as it builds up towards the climax is definitely the most riveting part of the book, and it builds up almost to a perfect crescendo because things are going at an easy pace, and then suddenly you actually get to almost relive the pattern of the last session or two, which is fantastic. And talking about India and Australia, I think it's really important that you do go into the earlier tours because unlike say England or Pakistan or some other countries with whom India shares a certain history, Australia and maybe New Zealand are countries with whom the histories, a lot of what India knows about those countries are through cricket. And I would assume it is the same vice versa. So it's really important to document Australia's tours in the 59-60 as well as the 69-70 tour to give an idea of what came before Border's team. And of course, that famous photograph that Jim Higgs takes in 1979, which, in a place in India where he sees to lose patience is to lose the battle, is something that Steve Waugh and several Australian cricketers have spoken of as a mantra that they've taken on as to India later on. So I think all that adds up really well. And I like the structure of the book. Talking about the players itself, though, one of the players, we've heard a lot about this test in India, and especially from the Australian lens, we've heard so much about it from Dean Jones. But one of the characters who comes across as a heroic figure here is Ray Bright. And I would like you to talk a bit about him. And, he had his own challenges with his health on that during that test. He was tremendously unwell, and he had to then come on and bowl in that final session. And of course, Border didn't say, let's get a Queenslander in here. But still, it seems that the heroism that went through Ray Bright was quite, if not on par, at least comparable to what Dean Jones went through.
Oh, I agree. I think Greg Matthews says that Ray Bright should have been the man of the match. Ray Bright was a guy who got picked for Australia when he was still a teenager. He's from Victoria, and he has showed such early promise. And then he had this strange career where he used to go on tours for Australia but not play that many test matches. And he was the most senior pro that they had in the team after Border. He actually predated Border. So he'd been in the side remarkably, never had a huge return of wickets. And it's interesting, leading up to the India test, when they were in New Zealand and it really was going sour for them and Border threatened to quit, it was Ray Bright who held a team meeting and basically said to them, oh, look, we've got to support Alan more. We've got to actually, we've got to turn this thing around. But he's not particularly fit. He wasn't an athletic player. He wasn't a massive turner of the ball either. He was kind of he was a good pro, shall we say. And the night before the match, he decides to, of all things, to go to bed early because the Australians are having a few drinks. And he says, no, I'm not going to have a few drinks. I might have a big day in the field tomorrow. I'm going to go to my room, because he orders a pizza in his room and gets terrible food poisoning. And he arrives at the ground and the first day and he just feels dreadful. And he's praying that Australia wins the toss and bats. And when Border comes back and he said, we won the toss, we're going to bat, he just collapses on the floor. And he basically, the floor of the change room, and he basically spends the entire day there. And then he's lying there and right in the last, the kind of the last half an hour of the day, David Byrne gets out after making 100 and Border decides to send him in as the night watchman, So he says, he looks up, he's lying on the floor of the change room, he looks up and there's Border standing over the top of him saying, get your pads on, you're going in. He says, when the Australian captain tells you to go in, you go and do it. But here's the point. He goes in that night and he bats it out. I think he's 2 not out. And the next day he goes in and he bats with Dean Jones for about 45 minutes. And, he's really struggling. He's just really, really unwell, but he hangs in there and he's such a professional player. There's a similar event by the time the final day comes around and he's in the rooms because he at one point he can't breathe properly and, Errol Alcott's very worried about his health. And he sends Dave Gilbert, the 12th man, And he says, you better go out and ask Alan if he wants me to come and bowl. And the message comes back, in very, very blunt terms that yes. So he gets up off the floor, puts his gear on, goes out and he takes these wickets that really set up the time because, India is really they need about 17 runs. They've still got 4 wickets in hand. And he comes on, he takes these vital wickets that do the job. And it's remarkable. And that's why Greg Matthews says, Greg Matthews' description of him was that he was walking around the field like a guy that had 15 beers. He said he wasn't even standing still in his fielding position. He was just kind of wandering around. He was that sort of discombobulated in his head. It's a fantastic physical effort to have done what he done. Certainly not taking anything away from the other players who did things as well. And certainly Jones paid a very heavy toll for his innings. But I do think that Ray Bright was remarkable. And that was the end of his career. He was not picked again for Australia after that tour. And he captained Victoria for several years afterwards. But he did have a remarkable moment in that match.
Yeah, and, we've spoken about Errol Alcott, we've spoken about Ray Bright. Now, we have to get to the two other characters who, really came to life on the final day of that match. And you have really brought their roles out really well, which is the umpires, Dara Dhotiwala and Vikram Raju. Sadly, Dhotiwala is no longer with us, but can you talk a bit about the talking to them and trying to find out their role and the attitude that the Australians had towards them? It seems to have been really challenging for them as well to get through that final day.
Yeah, really a lot. And I'll tell you a couple of things. Those two umpires were guests at that function, that charity match that I explained to you. And they walked around like they were a couple. They were kind of with each other the whole time. And Greg Matthews ran up and wanted to have a photograph taken with them, and he said, they're two of the bravest umpires that have ever stood in a test match, because his argument was that, neither of them umpired an international match after that tied test. And there's a sense that, I don't know if this is true, but there's a sense that perhaps they were not picked because of the result. I don't know if that's true or not. But I was always conscious with both of them that their English wasn't great, so I didn't want to misquote them in any way. So I spoke to them there, and then I spoke to them again later. Never did they deviate from their stories about what they thought had happened. And, there was some rancor, and Ravi Shastri went in the rooms afterwards and really gave it to them about what he thought of the decision. He just couldn't believe it. And it was a thrill for me because last year I was in Delhi and Vikram Raju was there and with his wife, and I was able to give him a copy of the book. I think he was really humbled by it, and it was really lovely to meet him and to talk again. And even then, he maintained everything that he'd said in the times I'd interviewed him before. He said that he didn't know what the score was. He wasn't trying to be part of history. He thought the wicket was out, and it wasn't up to them to decide. Now, having said that, the other thing about this, which I think is remarkable about it, is the physical toll of standing for 5 days is a lot, as we know. Concentration, the heat, everything. And he talks about how they used to come off for the breaks and they'd take their jackets off and their tie. And Bob Simpson, the Australian team manager, said to them, why don't you just leave your jackets off? But they didn't feel that they could. So they wore their jackets the whole time, And to concentrate, when you think about it, and then also they'd had this at least an hour of arguments back and forth with Alan Border about field placings and about how slow the game was going and what was going on. And the Australians were vigorously appealing for everything. It's a real test of concentration. Now, I think that Dara Dhotiwala really had imposed himself. I think he had that personality. He wasn't going to put up with anything. Earlier in the game, he'd made Dean Jones change his boots because he felt that he was running on the pitch and causing damage. So, and there's a great story too about when Bob Simpson gets so upset about this that he comes onto the field to remonstrate. And he just says, the umpires just say to him, you're the coach, you're not allowed to be on the field. I'm not listening to you. This is how determined they were and how organised they were. So I had great admiration for them in those circumstances. I think in a way they're a team within a team, because those two guys are they've got the lonely job. And I found them, the 3 times I spoke to them, incredibly consistent with their answers, and also, I think, really pleased to have been part of history. I think they really enjoyed it. But I thought I was full of admiration for them, and it was a big effort. And I know that the Australians felt that even though they argued with them, they felt that they did a good job.
I found the role of Dhotiwala particularly interesting here. One, throughout the match, he comes across as this strong-willed umpire who can stand up to Alan Border and the Australians. And that is something that typically Indians will admire, right? And then he was not at the end for the final over, so he didn't have the burden of making the final decision. And he knows the repercussions of making that final decision. For instance, Ravi Shastri strongly believes it was a mistake. He could have easily turned around and said, if I had been there, I would have given it not out. The fact that he stood by his colleague pretty much throughout, like you mentioned, even in the charity game, he stands by the colleague, speaks volumes about his character and about how much he stood up for Vikram Raju.
I completely agree. And, Ravi Shastri when I spoke to him about it, I said, do you think Navin Singh hit it? And he said he didn't hit it, he smashed it. He said it was a terrible inside edge. I mean, he was completely convinced the decision was wrong. But those two umpires, they weren't, they were their own, but there was a humility to them as well. That's what I'm saying. When I met them on several occasions, they were happy to talk about it. They went through it, and they wouldn't take any sort of suggestion that, did you know this? No, that's what we did. And you're right, they supported each other right through the whole thing. And I'm full of admiration for them.
Yeah, and I think, by now it's time that we really empathize with their position, given what we have seen with the technology and DRS and the fine margins of errors that even the multiple cameras around the ground can't pick up. After umpiring for 5 days on the final ball, on the final over, you have to make a decision like that. This is the time we really need to, doff our hats to them and say the fact that they even kept their heads is a big achievement.
I agree. Yeah, you're exactly right. And keeping your head's a good description of it, because also, as much as, you have this Alan Border, getting upset about being pressured for time, you've also got the responsibility of these two guys to run the game knowing that they're going to lose the light. And imagine the consequences of that. If they hadn't got the play done, well, I think they did a remarkable job.
Which then brings me to that final wicket. And of course, there is this wonderful story that you have of the photographer who captured that moment, Mala Mukherjee. She it was a coincidence that she was there at the right place at the right time. She snapped the photograph, and of course, that is the photograph that has been, associated with that game for all these years. Was that something that you knew right from the beginning, that when you write this book, that's going to be on the cover? Or and if you can just talk us about that photograph, because a lot has been written about it and about Alan Border's reaction, and people have said that the fact that he's not even appealing shows that he knew there was an edge. Has that photograph been scrutinized too much?
Yeah, well, possibly. Mike Coward told me the story of Marla and how she had taken the photograph, and I was able to interview her, and she was tremendous, and she, gave us permission to use the photograph for the book. There is another photograph taken, more or less at ground level, probably from point which looks more or less over Alan Border's shoulder. And it's a really interesting photo, and you can see Bruce Reid running in toward the wicket with his arms raised above his head. And Border is kind of scrambling around, or he's looking back at the umpire. And Nina Singh is looking a bit confused. It's a really good photo. It was used in the Australian Cricket Board's annual report in 1986. We were never able to find the original image because it's got writing and headlines all over it. We were never able to find it but I'm sure it was taken by an Indian photographer, because the reason Marla got the great shot that nobody else got was that all the rest of them, thinking that India would win, went down to the boundary sideline to get the photographs of the post-match presentation. And she decided that she would take one photo of every ball of the last 2 overs. And that's how she got it. So it is fascinating. And with the border question, you're exactly right. And Alan, by his own admission, he says, my first instinct was to get the ball in case India ran. That was his description of what went on, was that the ball had popped out, he had to run and get the ball. And then he said everyone was running around and screaming and yelling. And he said, I kind of looked back over my shoulder. I think by that point, the finger has down. So the decision had already been given, which is why he has that confused look on his face. And he said in the interview, I didn't know, have we won, have we lost? I don't know what's going on, but, people are grabbing stumps and charging off the ground and all sorts of mayhem. So I think that's a reasonably logical explanation of what he looks like. And Marla's photo is fantastic because it's a great moment. And, you talk about confidence. You see where Greg Matthews is going. He looks like he's got his arms out like the wings of a Spitfire. He's just in flight. He knows it's happened. And Border looks so confused, but others look quite confident. So, you got to read into what you want. But it's similar, I think, as there's that amazing photo taken of the Tide Test in Brisbane as well, when the stumps are knocked down, when the West Indian players look like they're dancing. So it's a fantastic image. So I was thrilled to get Marla involved. And as you know, she's not a sports photographer. She's an artist and she has her own gallery, and, she's an esteemed photographer. Just happened to be she was at the cricket with her husband at the time. She took the photo.
Yeah, that's such a lovely, lovely moment for me. I mean, here's the person who's just at this test. She's not a professional, she's not assigned to cover this test as a photographer, but she's come here and she's taken this photo. And it's so amazing that all these years later, that photo still captures so much. That detail and that interview with her and talking to her, that really was very touching. So I really wish that, a lot more people recognize the value of that photo and what she has, the fact that she was there at the right place at the right time, how much it has added to the romance of that test. A couple of things about that test. You do mention in the book that when people say Tide Test, the first image that comes to mind is the Brisbane Test, at least for many in Australia. Talking about, the comparisons, that the series in 1961, of course, was one of the greatest series of all time. And the same can't be said for this series, which, the next two, this was a tie, and then you had draws after that. So, and in terms of just the drama and quality, none of the other matches could match this. So do you think that, that aspect, as well as the aspect of lost footage, as well as generally the Australian team moving on from there and then going on to become a juggernaut, do you think all that has played a part in, this test gradually receding from memory? I mean, of course, books like these are great to revive that, but generally, do you think that this test is slowly being forgotten?
Yep. And I think I don't think it gets the credit it deserves. I really don't. I think that, Bob Simpson's the only person who was at both. He was in that Tide Test in Brisbane as a player, and he was coach of Australia. He thinks Madras was a better game, a more significant game. You're right about the series against West Indies, Australia. It was an incredible series, and it was the first of many remarkable results, and really endeared cricket back to Australia. It was a romantic summer for Australia. This was not the case with this, but the passion that the guys had who played in that game has not waned. And, a lot of those guys didn't make it through, but didn't make it through to that sort of golden age. But if you look at Craig McDermott, Dean Jones, David Boone, Jeff Marsh, Steve Waugh, Alan Border. That's a pretty good nucleus. And the other guys slowly fell away from the team and they were replaced and other players came in. But that side that went on to win the World Cup in 87, I think they really felt that they'd been through the hard years and that they'd really had to rebuild Australian cricket and what it meant to play for Australia. And I think that's the legacy for this country. It was not so easy, I think, to find a legacy in that test match in India because I think probably it would be fair to say that India felt that it lost that match in the sense that that was a home series and that, as you say, it had a tied test and then 2 draws. It was probably move on to the next thing. But then, as I mentioned, they were already a great side and there's so many great players in that team. And remember that Vinsaka didn't even play in that match. He was out injured and he'd been the player of the series against England. So, in that respect, I suspect for India it was a disappointment. But for Australia, it needs to be up there with the greatest test matches that they've been involved in. And I think it's a shame that there's no footage of it and it's a shame that in a way it's starting to fade. But it's my opinion that it's one of the great test matches ever played and therefore it's also one of the great test matches for this country.
Absolutely. And I think, you're right about the Indian perspective. I mean, India was the home team then, and they were expected to win. And the fact that they got so close to chasing that total and then couldn't make it, and then they couldn't end up winning the series, I think all that made it a little more disappointing from their end. And in terms of the narrative, unlike for Australia, which it ended up being the starting point of a really glorious journey, for India, it wasn't anything of that sort. I mean, it was more like one great game, and then, you had this various ups and downs continue. But I can tell you from someone who was really young watching that game, these players were all like really well known in India, very popular. David Boone was one of the most popular cricketers among Indians of my generation who watched then. He was also really good in that 1991-92 series when India went there. So we used to really like him. And as someone from Chennai, Mahesh can confirm that all these players, right? I mean, they're really, really adored in Chennai. Steve Waugh, Dean Jones, Alan Border. Mahesh?
Yeah, I mean, so I started watching cricket at the ground in 2001. And since then, I've watched pretty much every game there. For the next 10 years, people are still talking about Dean Jones' innings. People who were fortunate enough to be there in 86, they still talk about it. So there's not a single visit to Chepauk where I don't hear about stories of the tight test. From people that I know, from people that I do not know, they could be sitting 3 rows away. And all of a sudden, you're socializing over a cricket conversation, and the conversation invariably goes back to the tight test.
Yeah, I think Chepauk has been fortunate to see some epic India-Australia games, tight test, the World Cup game in 87. There was that 1998 test with Tendulkar and Shane Warne having that famous battle, 2001 test. I mean, it's just a ground that is meant to host India-Australia games.
That's so true. And the other point which puzzled me initially when I was reading about tight test, and I wasn't watching it at that time because I was too young. When I discovered about tight test, the first thing that struck me is this happened in September. Come on, no way it would have been that hard for Dean Jones to struggle so much. And on that, extending on that, what struck me about this tight test versus, let's say, the Brisbane one, is that it's just the odds have to fall in place, right? It's very likely sometime in the next 100 years, we will witness a total cricket classic like the Brisbane tight test. But for something like this to fall in place, it's almost a unique legacy of its time, because even Alan Border talks about it after many years later, where he says, we did not understand how dehydration worked, or the pain or the perils of dehydration. Otherwise, I may not have pushed my players so much. So subsequently, when Australia came back in 98, they played the Chennai test in March, which must have been hotter than this. And in 2001, again, they played in March. So each team subsequently were much better prepared to handle the heat. So in many ways, this cannot happen again because our knowledge of science is getting better, our knowledge of recovery is getting better, and teams are getting more professional. So it's almost impossible for us to get another test like this where external factors played such a massive influence.
You make a very good point. And Steve Waugh has said, now a game like this would have been called off. And I don't quite know what that means because I've never seen a test match called off because it's too hot. But I think what he's getting at is exactly your point, which is the lack of science and understanding. I mean, Errol Alcott had, from his own notes, he said he had, ordered water for the rooms. And in a miscommunication, they had delivered bottles of Pepsi. And, he said that, so in the end, he kind of just did what he could to set up almost like a triage station, Bath, put the ice in there, and Jones would come off and the players would strip all his gear off and they'd put him in the shower and put him in the bath and run the shower over his head and then, put his pads back on, put his clothes back on and send him out to bat again. It sounds barbaric, doesn't it, compared to the circumstances now? The question that I've always had is that, there's this famous moment which has been told so many times that, when Jones says to Border when they're batting, he says, I'm finished, I can't go on. And Border challenges him in a very rough way and says, if you can't go on, then I'll bring out a real Australian, I'll bring out a Queenslander, which was to appeal to his parochialism. And if you think about it, the match comes down to one run either way. What if Jones had said to Border, yeah, okay, I will go off because I'm really losing concentration here. And they had brought out Greg Ritchie, and Greg Ritchie had belted, let's say, a quick 40, and Jones had recovered and come back in. The match may not have ended. So your point is right. There are so many circumstances and things that happen that could have got us all that way, not to mention the Chappell Dev innings. And also, Gavaskar on the final day comes in and, he hits 90. He's like, more or less in the first session, playing audacious shots getting toward the end of his career. And, he was not a fan of one-day cricket. He really liked Test cricket, but he bought into that idea that this was the way India was playing and this was the verve of the moment. And, there was everybody seemed to be involved doing something, and all those circumstances, all those great players came together for this remarkable result. And, yeah, it could be a long time before we see another one.
Absolutely. And we were talking just before the recording, we were talking about how Steve Waugh basically had that slight misfield, which allowed, India to get back for 2 runs, Ravi Shastri, and to get back for 2 runs. And who knows, had Waugh been sharper on with that throw, who knows how that could have turned out. So that's how fine the margins were.
Well, he's still embarrassed by that. I mean, he still, Steve Waugh still rolls his eyes when he's asked about it. He just, for that exact reason, I think. He says, I was standing in the outfield and that last ball thing, please don't hit it to me. And that's an awful mindset, isn't it, for the professional athlete to say, I hope I'm not involved in this. Nobody wanted to make that mistake. So you're right. I mean, everything comes down to a fine moment here. Well, Yadav comes in late. He has 1 scoring shot, and it's a 6. I think it's absolutely remarkable, that shot, which does exist on YouTube. You can actually see that. But, I mean, for a guy at the tail of an innings like that to come out, bang, back straight over the bowler's head for 6, and that's the only scoring shot that he had. I think he faced 8 deliveries. It's fantastic stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's another player who's, who had a instrumental role to play in that test, and we should acknowledge his both his bowling as well as that shot that set it up in the end. So
another comparison that because I watched both these documentaries back to back yesterday, another striking sort of comparison that struck me was the fact that Chennai had this extraordinary heat and it was very challenging conditions. If at all, you would expect players to kind of not be rational in their approach. You would have expected that to happen in Chennai and not in Brisbane. But if you watch the documentary on that Brisbane tie test, you will see Richie Bennett running for crazy panicky singles. They could have had 20 runouts, out of which they eventually ended up having 3 or 4 runouts. So the sense of control and calm in a very extremely tense situation in Chennai was so much better to watch. And even Ravi Shastri, for instance, the way he rationalizes taking that single. And in fact, it's beautifully captured in the Madras Magic documentary, where Shastri says, that's the last thing Alan Border would have wanted me to do. And then they go to Alan Border, and the next thing he says, I don't know why he did it. And I was happy that he did it. So the cold and calculated and pretty much rational approach in such tense situation was quite an eye-opener for me. I would have expected it to be reversed between Brisbane and Chennai, especially given the excruciating heat and all the illness that players suffered. But most of them, except for the Steve or Misfield, most of them seems to have done their part really well. And that seems to have elevated the last hour contest even more.
You make a really good point about Ravi Shastri, and I found that absolutely fascinating, that his clarity of thought in that moment was, I'll take the single because then we can't lose. And then we've got, I think it was 3 balls left to make it happen. But the second part was that they had already discussed that. They had discussed that, the 2 batsmen together, to say, this is what's going to happen. If I get a single, we're going to go for it, and then we'll put the game there. And all the Australians were incredulous. I mean, at the final moment, when there's just minutes left in the game, the thing turns on its head again. And Australia is lost. Why did he do that? And you think about it, it's completely logical, but I admire that clarity and that clearness with everything that's going on. And given that Shastri has hit some enormous blows, some beautiful shots in his innings, I mean, he's really taken them apart. And he's exhorting the crowd. You know, he's standing there waving his bat over his head, getting the crowd stirred up. So his adrenaline must have been flowing. And, you know, he was really taking it to the Australians. I mean, he was whipping this game up, this final half an hour up, that, you know, we're going to overrun. You know, he must have read the body language of the Australians and all sorts of things going on out there, that they're deteriorating, that they're lacking confidence. You know, he was such a charismatic figure when he played. I thought I couldn't agree with you more. I thought he was fantastic to talk to, and very similar to the umpires. You know, his story has never changed over the years. You know, and he remains convinced of those circumstances.
I mean, so cold was Shastri in his calculation that he even talks about the fact that the next 2 tests are in Delhi and Bombay, which are flat wickets, which could be draws. So if we lose this test, then we could lose the series. I mean, this is how far he's been thinking in that tension and craziness.
Yeah, it was fantastic. It was almost as if saying, we've got to take this now because there's 2 more test matches, but can't guarantee that's going to happen. No, I thought he was tremendous. Very, very interesting guy to interview. I really enjoyed listening to him and hearing his thoughts. And, you know, I think he's a self-made cricketer. You know, that's how I read it. My understanding of him is that he was a player, perhaps not, you know, similar to Ray Bryant, who didn't have necessarily the gifts that others had, but worked very hard. And I suspect as a result of that, thought logically about cricket and thought through every situation and made the best of it. And as he did then, I mean, who knows if you didn't have someone calm like that, what might have happened?
Yeah, and did you get a chance to speak to Maninder Singh as well? Because it seems it was very touching to see how Maninder has reconciled completely to that decision. I mean, he of course says that he hit it, but he has empathized with the umpires and he understands. And of course, we know that Maninder has gone through his own upheavals in his career and things. So, did you get a chance to speak to him?
He was a player that I was only able to see the interview that he had done. Okay. So I was able to listen to all of that. And I thought he was, again, very interesting. You know, he was a guy who, you know, there was a lot of pressure on him as a young player in particular, wasn't there? That he was, you know, he was going to be the next bowler. You know, he was going to, you know, I just think he was under a lot of pressure. He's going to be Vishen Bedi, and he had to kind of perform and all of those things. And in the end, you know, possibly unfairly gets characterised as the guy who cost the test match. When, you know, perhaps he did, perhaps he didn't. But yeah, I found him, the interview I saw with him, which I was able to use for notes and for quotes, I thought he was tremendous and a very interesting guy to talk to. And you're right, had a lot of sympathy for others. You know, he's the one who famously said that, you know, sometimes when you're bowling to a player like Dean Jones, he said it's an honour to be out there because someone's playing so well. Having said that, they also got into each other big time, and that I know that he gave Jones a spray when Jones got out in the second innings as he was going off, and there was some ill temper between them at the time. So, I'm not saying he was a passive character in the whole thing, but his reflection of the game, yes, is very even-handed and forgiving of others.
Yeah, again, one of the interesting bits in the book, one of the several interesting bits in the book is about how, the difference between how someone like Dean Jones played the Indian spinners and how the Indian batsmen played the Australian spinners. And, that's a very interesting contrast that I found, and which I would, urge you to read and also take delight in. So this was wonderful. Mahesh, do you have anything else to add? I've pretty much covered what I have to.
I would like to profusely thank Michael for this book because it's a very important, historically significant event for cricket and particularly for Indian cricket. I know the feelings are very similar in Australia, where this is seen as the forgotten tight test. But in India, it's far worse, and we don't even have a Brisbane tight test to compare it with. So it's a much more significant piece of work for Indian cricket. So, and I'm extremely grateful to you for that. And I also would like to tell listeners that while he sets the context for the Australian team coming into that test, he also paints a beautiful portrait of the Indian team at that time, and particularly a very endearing portrait of the main protagonists. There's a line that he writes about Sunny being a player who plays in harmony with the state of the match. We've seen Sunny being described as many things in India, as a slow batter, as someone who can bat fast if required. Ram Guha writes about the two Gavaskars in his book. But this line captures the essence of Sunny's batting. He bats in harmony with the state of the match. So I liked all the portraits that he wrote of the Indian players as well. So beyond the tight test as well, I think it's a very, very important book. And I'm very, very grateful to Michael for writing this.
Thank you.
Yes, profuse thanks from me as well. And Michael, just before you go, we do ask our guests, especially guests who are journalists and writers and people who are into reading, to recommend one book to our listeners. This could be a book about, this is a book that we ask about cricket, but it could be about cricket in anywhere, Australia or any other place. Something that you would like our listeners to pick up?
I think it's two. Can I mention two?
Sure.
So I love Duncan Hamilton's biography of Harold Larwood. I thought that was tremendous. And I thought John Lazenby's book, Edging Toward Darkness, about the last timeless test, South Africa, England, before the war, was also great. I used it as a bit of a guide, but it was different in that John was dealing with a match where nobody was left alive from it. So his was more of a work of history, whereas I was fortunate to have people who could still remember playing in it. But I thought both those books, John has a great ability to evoke another era of cricket, and I thought Duncan's work on Harold Larwood was just fantastic.
Wonderful. So I will link those two books in the notes, and I would urge our listeners to pick it up. Both terrific books. I'm going to revisit John's book now that you talk about it. And Harold Larwood, of course, it's one of the great books in cricket literature. So yes, please pick it up. So thank you so much, Michael. This was fantastic. And thanks again for writing the book, and thanks for joining us.
It was an absolute pleasure, and I apologize for the dog in the background.
Oh, not a problem at all. What is the dog's name? We should know.
Her name is Tilly, as in Matilda.
So thank you, Matilda. Oh, Matilda. Okay. Yeah. So quintessentially Aussie. So
that's it.
Okay. Wonderful. So not a problem. I guess Matilda needs to get in a say as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you.
India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wide.